So I've been on the hunt for a truly pocketable everyday carry camera that does not sacrifice on image quality like an iPhone does. I'm not saying iPhones are bad, I definitely feel there's a time and place for them, but they just look and feel too digital with their small sensor, their HDR photos, and also the lack of natural depth of field. I was definitely suspicious about trying out this Ricoh GRIII just from the form factor of how small and compact it is. I just did not think it's going to meet my photography needs. But for the last week, I've pretty much taken it everywhere and I've been really surprised, especially with the image quality. So in today's video, we're going to give you a real world review of the Ricoh GRIII. Is it worth buying in 2023? It was released in June 2020, making this camera 3 years old at the time of recording this video. The first thing I want to touch on is definitely image quality, as this is something that really surprised me. It does have the film simulations like you do have on Fuji cameras, but we'll get into that later in the video. Now, when I picked up this camera, I was definitely not confident using it, and that's just because of the LCD screen. The LCD screen isn't really the best. I know that Sony's are pretty bad, but this is on a whole new level of being really bad. It doesn't really show you your true exposure, and it doesn't really look that good and confidence inspiring when you're looking through just the LCD screen. There is no viewfinder, so you just have to rely on that LCD screen. You can get optical viewfinders as an add-on accessory. But after I brought the photos into Lightroom, I was pleasantly surprised, and they actually edited up really well. A couple of these photos, I purposely did underexpose the photos just to retain the details in the highlights. Like this photo here, it was a very bright and warm winter's day here in the Gold Coast, Australia, and I really wanted to retain the details in the whites of this photo, resulting me in underexposing by about 1.5 stops. And when editing this photo, I had a lot of dynamic range to play with in Lightroom. Here's another example that I actually underexposed by about 2.5 stops, and I really wanted to test out the GRIII and see how much shadow detail we could get while retaining the highlights. Usually when you underexpose this much, you would lose a lot of details in the shadows and you would introduce a lot of noise, but we managed to retain all the details and highlights and the shadows with minimum amount of noise, which is pretty outstanding. And with the new AI feature in Lightroom, you can just clean up that noise anyway, so I was really surprised. And that's because this GRIII actually does have a APS-C 24.2 megapixel sensor. It does have a mechanical shutter, with the max shutter being 1/4000. But from f2.8 to f5.6, it is a max shutter of f1/2500. But you actually get 2 stops of internal ND, just like you do on the Fuji X100V. Now the GRIII does actually come in 2 different options, which will give you the full frame field of view of 28mm and the 40mm option. There is 2 other variants, the Diary and the Street Edition, but they're basically just different colors. I was testing out the 28mm, and you actually have an in-body crop, which will give you the full frame field of view of 35mm and 50mm. If you pick up the 40mm option, you get a 50mm and a 71mm in-body crop. And again, that screen was not giving me any confidence shooting at 50mm. It was just showing me a bunch of noise and grain and artifacts, and I just thought that it was cropping in too much for the sensor to handle, but I actually took some of my favorite photos at the 50mm end. And before making this video, I really did not want to research about the GRIII. I didn't want to watch too many videos. I literally just wanted to pick it up, take it out, shoot, edit the photos, and then research about the camera. And that's why I was so surprised that it has a little mechanical shutter, that it is an APS-C size sensor at 24 megapixels, and that's why the 50mm in-body crop actually holds up so well. So I did actually take this little Ricoh GR3 on a quick portrait shoot just to test out the skin tones and also the autofocus of this camera. Our model was Demi. Carlo actually organized the shoot, so shout out to him. And we had Mitch and also my girlfriend Maria was on BTS. So everyone's links to their social media is linked down in the description down below. Also, if you like the way that I edit my photos, I do sell Lightroom presets. They are also linked down below. So this little Ricoh GR3 actually does have face and eye autofocus, and that's actually real-time tracking as well. It's not as good as say like a Canon or a Sony autofocus, but it's definitely on par or even maybe a little bit better than a Fuji camera, like the X100V. And while I was culling these photos in narrative select, a lot were in focus and a lot were sharp from this little 18mm APS-C lens. Now the autofocus isn't amazing. There was a couple of times it would completely miss, but it would generally hit its mark about 9 times out of 10. So on the 28mm and the 40mm, you both get a macro mode, which I was super surprised about. I'm definitely no macro photographer, but I tested it out and the autofocus worked pretty well in macro mode. Also, you can do double exposures in cameras. Now, again, this is not really my photography style of double exposures, just because I don't really know how to do it. But on this GR3, you can take a photo, say, of a leaf, and then you can recompose your photo and see the double exposure in live view. So this actually does have film simulations like Fuji, and you get 12 options. I'm not really a massive fan of film simulations. On one hand, I like the fact of perfecting your exposure with a JPEG, and you really have to make sure you're lighting things properly and the subject is well lit and the background's not too bright. But I do tend to underexpose my photos a little bit just to retain a little bit of detail in certain places, and I just enjoy editing photos. The only ones that I really like was the positive film and also the monochrome black and white. I tried a pretty popular one called Cotton Color 400, which is based off the really popular film stock of Portra 400, but it didn't really look like Portra 400 in my honest opinion. I shoot a lot of Portra 400 at weddings and also 800 at weddings, and I feel that my Lightroom presets are more similar to Portra 400 than the Cotton Color 400. So maybe I did it wrong, maybe it just needs a little bit of tweaking. When I use the Fuji X-E4 and the F, I use a similar film simulation that looks kind of like Portra, but then I shot side by side with actual Portra 400 and they're definitely different. So I just feel that I can get a better result in Lightroom. Just like Fuji, you can adjust the parameters like saturation, hue, contrast, clarity, and also the grain effect. And you also get that dynamic range correction of the highlights and the shadows. So a little bit of flexibility, and it's pretty much the same simulations or similar to the Fuji cameras. When a camera is designed so well as the Ricoh GR3, there's not really much that will improve the shooting experience. If anything, overall, the simplicity of this camera is definitely its biggest strength. Like this square hood kind of defeats the point of being able to put in your pocket, but I did actually find some pretty cool accessories that look pretty cool. Like I definitely recommend putting one of these little cheap thumb grips that just slides into the hot shoe. I would definitely have the included wrist strap on your wrist because this camera is really small and it's pretty easy to drop. One thing that's pretty cool is that you can actually buy 2 different optical converters that will give you different focal lengths optically, so not in body crop. One of them is a teleconverter, which will give you the optical 60mm full frame field of view. It's actually advertised as a 75mm because when you attach it, it gives you a small crop. But if you don't want to use that crop at all and want to have it at 60mm, you can just cover up these connections. And something that's awesome is that there is a wide angle conversion. So you can have a 21mm full frame field of view. Okay, so I know that I've been praising this camera a lot, but there is a couple of negatives that I do need to touch on. One of them is definitely battery life. These batteries coming out of this camera are very small and they do not last long. On the Ricoh website, it says you do get approximately 200 images. I found that the camera, while shooting continuously, say at this portrait shoot, would last about half an hour to 45 minutes. And also when you change the battery out, the camera inside there is super hot and the battery is right up next to that SD card. So you do have the risk of burning an SD card being right next to the battery. That is definitely something to consider, as SD cards don't like that much heat. I did touch on how bad the LCD screen is, as it doesn't really show you what your exposure is, and you can't really gauge it as well. I definitely think that the Fuji cameras are a lot better with the LCD screens, and there was a lot of times that I underexposed my images by accident, and that's just because it was a bright sunny day here in the Gold Coast and the screen just could not keep up, and it just threw off the exposure so much. There is an exposure compensation that I probably should have been looking at, but it just seemed like if I exposed properly, like say like 0.3 of a stop under, the image would look overexposed, but in reality, the image was properly exposed. It was just the screen that was not showing the proper exposure. You can actually shoot video on this camera and it looks okay. You get HD or 1080p right up to 60 frames per second. Another time that I tried to use the video, for whatever reason, it does not look 1080p. It looks like it's at 720 or 480. Doesn't really hold up that well. It's an 8-bit standard video file, so no flexibility in post. The GR3 is definitely not there for vlogging. It's a great photography camera. I was really impressed with the autofocus, the image quality, the detail coming out of this camera, the depth of field at 2.8, the small compact size. It really does fit in your pocket. So if you want to pick up the GR3 and any of these accessories, there will be links in the description down below. Also, if you like the way that I edited my photos, my presets worked really well with this Ricoh GR3, and they are linked down in the description down below. So hit me up in the comment section with your thoughts and questions about the GR3. I love diving into that comment section and interacting with you guys. And if you want to watch a video that's pretty similar to this Ricoh GR3, I've done a video on these Fuji cameras. I think the image quality is on par. There's definitely a few differences and similarities, but the Fujis are definitely not pocketable. If you want to watch that video, check it out here. Otherwise, hit the like button, subscribe, and we will see you next week.